Dialogue, which today is on historical trauma and its development implications across generations. My name is Peter Taylor. I'm a professorial research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to moderate this conversation today. Just as a little bit of background to the conversation, our starting point is that historical trauma arising from experiences such as colonialism, slavery, violent conflict, and systemic disposition can have really profound and lasting effects on societies. And we know that across generations, these experiences shape the institutions, political institutions, economic opportunities, social relations, and patterns of trust. And all of these influence development trajectories in complex ways. So this is one strand of a series of very significant conversations at the moment about development, the nature of development, and the future of development. So I think the timing is really good. And we will hear from three excellent speakers. They're going to bring a range of different perspectives, and we're also going to hear some case studies. And the aim is to connect historical analysis with contemporary development debates in order to highlight why understanding historical trauma is essential for interpreting current development challenges and for designing more context-sensitive research and policy responses. So that's our aim for the day. And we have three fantastic speakers. I'll just quickly introduce them. Firstly, Nathan Nunn is a professor at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And he's going to focus his presentation on some of the findings on intergenerational transmissions of trauma, drawing on his paper, Zero-Sum Thinking and the Roots of US Political Differences. And then we will hear from Professor Maria Micaela Sviatschi. She's an associate professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University, and she's going to talk about how rebel governance affects long-term development and drawing on a case of the persistent effects of guerrillas in El Salvador. And then finally, we will hear from Professor Mustahid Husain, an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, also in Canada. And he will present on intergenerational trauma, compounded exclusion, and suicide risk amongst Bangladeshi Canadian youth. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating set of presentations. Each speaker is going to talk for about 15 minutes. And then I hope very much at the end, we'll have an opportunity for a conversation. The idea is that this will be for an hour, but if the conversation is really going, then I think we'll be able to just extend for a little bit longer. It would be great to know who is here with us in this virtual room. So if you would just like to put some more, just to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. Anna, if you could just move the slide for me just for a second. Yeah, let's keep going. And yeah, there we go. It's moving so fast. So just to say, the session is being recorded and it will be available on the EADI's website and YouTube channel. As I've just said, please use the chat box to introduce yourself. Any comments, questions, useful links, all part of the dialogue. When you do have an opportunity to engage, please put your camera on. It's really nice just to see who you are. And if we could just ask you also to keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. I think, Anna, there was one more slide, if I'm not mistaken. There we go. So yeah, when we come round to the Q&A, if you'd like to raise your hand, but do put questions and comments in the chat, that will be really useful. And I think at this point, we'll get going. So Anna, if we could remove the slides, thanks very much indeed. And Nathan, over to you.
Great. Yeah. So, okay. Terrific. I assume everyone can see and hear that. I'll put my timer on so I don't go over. 1 second. Okay, terrific. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Talking about historical trauma and the intergenerational consequences of historical trauma. So if I'm thinking about the literature within economics, there seems to be accumulating evidence that traumatic events can have effects and that these effects persist for multiple generations. Some of the work I've done, which is a few decades now, looked at the slave trade within Africa and how this led to distrust of descendants multiple generations after the slave trade ended, where the slave trade was about 1500 to about 1850 within the continent. And then subsequent work of my students have looked at other events and found similar evidence of long-run consequences of the colonial experience, for example. So Sarah Lowe's and Eduardo Montero have a paper that looks at medical campaigns in French Equatorial Africa and the impacts that had in the long run on medical distrust. And similarly, forced rubber collection in the Congo, what consequences that had. And so these are just some examples, and I just highlight these because they're the ones I know most well because they're of my students. I think one thing that the literature is trying to do is understand the mechanisms of cultural transmission. So if we think about why these events would have effects that last hundreds and hundreds of years later, we can start to think about, well, what is the transmission from one generation to the next? And in the evolutionary anthropology literature, they talk about cultural transmission, which are these values, these beliefs, these norms that are transmitted. And they distinguish between vertical, so parents to children, and transmission. Oblique, so that would be children, but not from biologically related individuals. It could be aunts and uncles or a school teacher or someone else, a religious authority or anyone else. And then horizontal, so your friends. You affect your friends affect you. And then the other thing that's emerging, so I'll talk about that. That's why I highlight this. It'll be something that I'll discuss today. Is, well, it's not just trauma, but just any events in general can have effects that are then transmitted to future generations. So we're focusing on the negative events here, but one can also think about positive events, which is great for policy. Let's say we have trauma, we have negative events which have occurred, and we're thinking about, well, will positive factors have a symmetric effect, or will they have a very different effect, right? And so that's important to understand, right? So and then empirically, can we disentangle the different channels of transmission? And I'll talk about that. So, and even if we think about, well, when we think about traumatic negative events, we typically think of the global south, but does that mean none of this is relevant for the global north, right? And so that's one reason to look at a broader set, or at least think about a broader set of events. So I'm going to give you examples of research that's trying to do these things and look at these issues, which is a recent paper published in the American Economic Review. I should have put the citation, but you can reach out to me if you're curious about reading the whole paper. And what we did is we wanted to understand these mechanisms of transmission and events within the United States that affect the way people think today. And so we have a survey of about 20,000 people. It's online. We asked pretty standard things like policy views, et cetera. But then we asked detailed information about their ancestry. So where did you grow up? Where did your parents grow up? Where were they born? What was their occupation? Then how about your grandparents? The same thing, right? We'll come back to this even, did you have any ancestors that were enslaved, particularly relevant for African-American individuals, right? So trying to get some sense of ancestral experiences. And then because we have the respondents' attitudes and kind of different characteristics of them, we can connect those two things, okay? And what we focused on in this was something that we thought was important for understanding kind of the political turmoil, if you want to call it that, in the US today. And that's zero-sum thinking. So what this means is the view that any wealth or benefits which is accrued to one individual or one group come at the expense of another group or individual. In other words, the size of the pie is fixed. So if one group gets more, another group gets less. So whether this is good or bad is part of what we learned here. And but if you just stop and think about it, you can see that zero-sum thinking, a zero-sum logic, permeates many of the issues that the US and much of the world is struggling with, right? So if we allow refugees or immigrants to come in, is there a cost to others? Are billionaires a good thing or a bad thing? Is there wealth coming at the expense of others, right? So we sought to measure this, actually, and so we did it with a series of questions, which just asks simply that. if one group gets more, does it mean that another group gets less? So I spare you all the details, but it's a series of questions. And then with principal components analysis, we can extract what's common in the responses to all these questions. And so what we find is if a person tends to believe that the benefits from one group come at the expense of another's, when it comes to immigration, they also tend to believe it when it comes to racial inequality, economic inequality, and even trade. So there is this common zero-sum perception of the world in general that people tend to have. Okay. And so why is this important? I just want to give you a tiny bit of evidence, and we'll look at the historical determinants of this. Well, one is it is correlated with political affiliation or political alignment. And it might be in a way that you might not have intuitively thought ahead of time. And so this is the histogram of the zero-sum index. So how zero-sum do you view the world based on those questions? And you see that Democrats tend to view the world slightly more in zero-sum terms. Okay, so the logic here would be, oh, the wealth of the rich, lots of that came from the poor, and therefore we should tax the rich. That's an important policy that would align with. But it also is counter, or I'll show you in a second, if you think in zero-sum terms, you're actually anti-open borders because you view costs of immigrants coming in. So there's a lot of nuance. And you can kind of see that here where it's not like one political group has one set of zero sum and another has a different set, and they're kind of distinct from one another. There's a huge amount of overlap. Okay, and then I won't go through it, but it explains some things like why did so many Democrats or at least people that voted for Obama subsequently vote for Trump? Why did so many people that supported Bernie Sanders subsequently vote for Trump, right? And the quick answer is Bernie Sanders and Trump both had zero-sum messaging, right? There's someone to blame for your misfortune, and we will just tell you who it is. And that appealed to a lot of people, and you see it in the data. So this zero-sum thinking is associated, it's kind of ironic, with support for redistribution. So the rich gained, but it came at the expense of the poor. So it's morally just to redistribute. Also, racial policies that reduce racial inequality. Again, there's one racial group that's richer, another racial group that's poorer. Those things are connected, and we think there is structural racism. So we support policies that fix that. Gender, same thing. And then strikingly, anti-immigration. So you wouldn't think of these bundles lined together, but they all correlate with the zero-sum thinking. And so the idea here is you view the benefits that immigrants are getting as coming at the cost of others. Okay. Okay, so that is basically, oops, I forgot my timer. That's basically the object that we want to look at. And so what historical events, including traumatic events, affected the extent to which people today, the descendants of those experiencing these events, think in these zero-sum terms, right? And we think this is important for politics and policy and a whole host of things. So the first thing we're going to look at, or we looked at, was race and enslavement. So we really just thought about what's important in US history, and this is the number one thing. So if you think about plantation slavery is a purely zero-sum activity. You're taking the labor through coercion of another individual, and the plantation owner is benefiting, right? It's not like a labor market where both sides gain. And so if you just look at the data, the first thing you see is African Americans are the most zero-sum group of all other groups in the data. So zero-sum index is your index of zero-sum thinking, and it's the highest, and these are 95% confidence intervals. So we also asked, were any of your ancestors enslaved? So you see that respondents, these 20,000 individuals, if you had an ancestor who was enslaved, you're much more zero-sum in your thinking, okay? Then the one thing which surprised us when we asked that question is we were thinking of plantation slavery, but a lot of people answered that they had ancestors who were enslaved who are not African American. So they were Japanese and said, my ancestors were interned, right? Or they were indigenous and said, my ancestors were put on reserves. Or they had ancestors who were indentured servants or suffered in the Holocaust, etc. So you actually see that amongst all these groups, that people do answer that their ancestors were enslaved, and you see a similar pattern, right? It's actually weakest for African Americans, which makes some sense because there was a lot of other oppression and zero-sum coercion besides formal enslavement, so Jim Crow laws, for example. So then in waves 5 to 7, we went back and asked, okay, if your ancestors were enslaved, exactly how were they enslaved? That's something we hadn't anticipated. And you see, regardless of the manner of enslavement, if you had an ancestor that was enslaved, then you're more zero-sum in your thinking today. Okay, so this is one example of a historical trauma having persistent effects. Of course, so if you remember the vertical versus oblique versus horizontal, this is most strongly evidence of vertical transmission. You had an ancestor, something happened to them, and then the effects were transmitted. So what about thinking about horizontal and oblique? So what you can do is ask, where did the respondent grow up, right? So what environment were they raised in? And how much slavery was there historically measured in 1860 in that environment? So that's going to capture a lot of horizontal transmission. And you can do the same thing. And what you find is if a respondent grows up in a place that had a lot of slavery historically, they're more zero-sum in their thinking, right? But what about their parents? So if their parents grew up in that setting, the respondent is also more zero-sum in their thinking. So that's going to be some horizontal transmission. Parents were influenced by the views of those around them, and that was transmitted to their children, and also can be oblique, right? Children growing up were influenced by people of the previous generation who were from that county. And we can do the same thing with grandparents as well. So if you think about my zero-sum thinking, it was influenced by where my grandparents grew up, all 4 of them. Okay, and so that's got to be some horizontal transmission. Growing up there, they were influenced by the people around them, and then that was passed on to parents and then to the respondent. Okay. And there's a neat kind of a natural experiment. Another way you could look at this is after the abolition of slavery, there was a very large number of white individuals, I think it was 1 million people that migrated from the south to the north. And it's been documented, so these are former plantation owners, that they brought this Confederate culture and they shaped even the political views today. So you can ask for people in the north or a respondent in the north, if they had more individuals that migrated from the south, then are they more zero-sum today? And you see that. So that's transmission through these migrants. So you start to realize it's something about people and transmitting values to people because you're not in the location that the slavery occurred. And same for parents and grandparents, right? And the other thing I should mention is these relationships are actually stronger for parents and grandparents, which makes some sense because they're closer to the time in which these events occurred. So they would have been influenced more, and then it's transmitted, right? So the other thing you can look at, these are the positive things, I'll just go through these quickly, is that, well, immigration. We don't think of immigrants coming in as necessarily historical trauma. It might actually be a benefit, and what effect did this have? And what you find is actually, if you've experienced immigration, either directly or you're the children of immigrants or grandchildren, you're less zero-sum in your thinking. Okay? And so the way to think of this is you've lived the American dream, you've made a better life, and you've experienced something that to you doesn't appear to be zero-sum or isn't zero-sum. Empirically, immigrants don't reduce the income of those around them. And so with this experience, you may evolve thinking that is less zero-sum. And that's what the evidence seems to indicate. And there's also evidence of this horizontal and oblique, similar to before. If you live in a county, grew up in a county, or your parents or your grandparents that had more immigrants that came during this big wave of migration, 1860 to 1920, the age of mass migration, then you're less zero-sum in your thinking. Okay? And so a likely mechanism is, we know immigrants led to increased prosperity, and increased prosperity and well-being tend to be associated with less zero-sum thinking. Okay? And then the last thing is, this is looking at prosperity directly. Why don't we just measure that, right? And so this is the flip side of historical trauma, or an event like poverty. And the question is, well, if you experience upward mobility, are you less zero-sum in your thinking? Or if you experience downward mobility, are you more zero-sum? So we asked people on a 1 to 5 scale to rank their family's level of income when they were growing up, right? And so if I think of how rich was my family when I was growing up, well, that's how rich were my parents while they were adults. Okay, so that question gives me my parents' level of income. I can ask how rich was my father or my mother when they were growing up? That gives you your grandparents. You can also ask how well off were your grandparents? That gives you your great grandparents' level of income when they were adults. And then also we ask the respondent right now, how wealthy are you? Right. And so this is just on a 1 to 5 scale. And then you can take the difference between each of these, 2 versus 1, 3 versus 2, 4 versus 3, to get mobility. That means how much has a scale changed from one generation to the next. Okay, so I won't show you everything, but I'll just show you this, which is how much has the income of the respondent changed relative to their parents, the respondent relative to grandparents, and the respondent relative to great grandparents. Okay. And what you find for all of these is greater upward mobility. That means things have gotten better, are associated with less zero-sum thinking. Okay. And the one thing here, though, is mobility above zero means over time things got better. Mobility less than zero means over time things got worse. Okay. So you see, I drew these big blue lines that are straight. That's actually not a great fit for the data. That if you look at it, it's actually flat here and then downward sloping. So doing better makes you less zero sum. Doing worse, it's not clear that makes you more zero sum. If anything, maybe less. Okay. And so one logic here, and this is one thing we need to look into more, is maybe if you are experiencing these negative shocks, people band together, and by helping each other out and cooperating, there's scope for positive sum benefits. If we help each other out, we can all be better off. Right. And maybe that's what these periods of lower mobility illustrate. But yeah, so this is just to illustrate that we have these differences and benefits and positive and negative can be very different. Okay, I'll end there actually. And so looking forward
Great.
to the discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant, Nathan. Thanks. Fascinating to see that research and to show the interrelationships between these different factors. I mean, I was reflecting as you were talking that for that last category around economic mobility here in the UK, we'd probably be thinking about class and how that would
Yeah,
play out in all of this. So really interesting.
yeah.
Also, just a big welcome to everybody who's joined us during the course of the session. We've got a really great, I'd say, global coverage from the North America, Latin America, Europe, Asia. So fantastic to see so many people joining us. Mary and Micaela, over to you.
Yes, let me share my screen. That was a fascinating talk, Nathan. You put the bar high for the rest of us. Let me see. Here it is. I have so many windows open. There we are. You can see my screen?
I think it's coming. Let's give it a moment. Sometimes it takes a moment to show. There it is. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, participants now can see your screen. Okay, thank you everyone so much for joining. I'm very excited. It was a challenge to present. I always present long and then instead of I try to reduce a lot the slides from other presentations. So, but this is joint actually work with Antonella Bandiera, Lelis Dinarte Diaz, Juan Miguel Jimenez, and Sandra Rosto. This is work that started a long time ago, but the key takeaway here, and I think that what is related to this webinar, is that the core message that I want you to take away is that this rebels territorial control can create durable alternative social contracts with persistent economic cost and also some social benefits. So let me motivate the talk with a common thing, which the motivation is what persists after rebel governance ends. We know that across developing countries, it is very common that groups, actors take control over the state territory. Also, there is a lot of evidence about the economic costs of violence that these actors can generate. But one unexplored channel that I want to focus today is how these armed actors, in particular guerrilla groups, rebels, can affect long-term development, which is the governance that they impose or the social contract that they create with civilians. And on this, there is literature, especially in rural developing countries, about how other non-state actors in general can impose institutions and provide public goods when the state is absent. However, we know very little about how the implications of rebel governance on development and whether a social contract that developed when the rebels are in control may persist once they even relinquish control. So the idea here is that the persistence will not be mechanical, so we will have both benefits and costs, and that's why we keep seeing this persistence. And in general, what we make emphasis is that many rebel groups, particularly left-wing insurgent groups, when they take territorial control during conflict, they develop a new social contract with citizens, which is based on three pillars, which are self-reliance, because the state is absent, so now communities have to learn how to organize and live without the states. Also, some source of redistribution in general when there is conflict, as I'm going to focus today, which is a conflict between a military-led elite and social wing, left-wing guerrillas, where there was a lot of violence. There will also an unequal distribution. These groups will also focus in this social contract on redistribution by providing insurance and support to vulnerable households and reducing inequality. And at the same time, they will generate this strong in-groups trust that may help to survive during conflict, given and they will provide security. So the question is, first, what are the implications of this new social contract that is based on these three pillars, and whether they shape socioeconomic outcomes, and what is the logic of that persistence? And in general, what I will show you, well, I will not show, I will talk, is that these rebel norms may persist because they still provide protection and solidarity and insurance, even in post-conflict settings, even if they limit economic integration and economic development. So I'm going to focus in this setting, which is El Salvador civil war. As many of you will know, in the 20th century, in El Salvador was characterized by these very high unequal and labor repressive models of agriculture, where you have these elites, and it was mostly a model of agriculture, and with very bad conditions for workers that were working in coffee plantations. So in 1950s, there were all these strikes from workers to demand better working conditions. And unfortunately, they were met by repression and indiscriminate violence by the state. And this will be very important because this setting of indiscriminate violence by the state will define which will be the social contract that these rebels will generate. There were a lot of assassinations of social leaders. So a lot of group of students and teachers, they organize in urban areas in El Salvador, and of course they have a left-wing agenda. And then the civil war started, which was a two-sided conflict between this military-led government and the FMLN. And what it is interesting, even though it started as a urban guerrilla, after they have their first offense, which failed against the state, then they decided to change the strategy and move to rural areas in the mountains. And this is where they establish control. This is a map of this guerrillas territorial control. All the gray areas were the places where they settle and establish these zonas liberadas, is called, which is areas where they consolidated territorial control until the peace agreements in 1992. And what they did in these areas is they did something, no? So we were having all this context of violence of the state. In these places, basically they took out if the state was present, they took it out, the local state and all the judicial authorities disappeared. And what they did was to impose a new type of governance, which was not imposed, actually, I'm using wrong the word, by these commanders, but most like self-governance through participatory institutions, because the idea of these commanders of the FMLN was that once the war was over, they wanted like to create power in the masses, in the citizens, so that they could self-govern themselves without relying on these elites. So all this led to, during the territorial control, on the development of new norms, which were more pro-social behavior, local cooperation, redistribution of land, but at the same time, a lot of distrust towards outsiders and the state, and especially because this was a state that was weak and violent. And again, that's why I make emphasis that the contrafactual during the rebel control was not a strong development state, but it was weak, unequal, and violent government. And this will have implications for external validity. So what we are going to do is just do a region discontinuity design, where we are going to compare areas that are inside these territories controlled by guerrillas versus areas that are very similar outside. And we are going to measure this since the guerrilla was over time. So we will be able to see the effects year by year for some outcomes. In general, what we are going to look, what I will show you is effects on nightlife, wealth, cooling, norms, safety, and resilience. So the first result is, this is measured in 2013 and 2007, is that there is these former guerrilla areas are poor decades after the control ended. In 1992, these guerrillas, they signed the peace agreement and the territorial control was ended, and all these commanders, they left these areas. It's not that they stayed, many went to urban places. So what was left is just like the consequence of this control or something, or the social contract, what we will try to argue. But the bottom line is that in terms of economic activity, we see lower economic activity measured with these slides, but also we have measures of income that I will show you in the next slide, lower asset wealth, and lower human capital in terms of lower years of education. And when we try to look whether it is something that mitigate in 2013, we can plot the nightlife coefficients year by year since the end of the civil conflict in 1992, and you can see that this nightlife gap between these areas that were under control versus nearby areas persists year by year after the war. Also, when we look at cohorts who made educational investments after the end of the territorial control, they also have lower years of education. So, and here is like the household income that we can measure since 2011 through household survey, and you can see that it doesn't seem that there is a mitigation over the years of the effect. And what it is more interesting is that even when we can see in the data whether public investment increased in these conflict areas, we see that it increased actually, like the state went there, still we see these negative effects in economic development. So what can be going on? And here is what we will argue and we will show is that when you look at these areas today, you see that these pillars that were of the social contract that they built are still present. First, we see that there is lower trust in institutions and politicians. Even though the institutions change, it's not that this military-led elite continue in 1992. There were elections, as you may know, democracy came, but still it was a weak democracy, we could say. And also we also find that there was lower willingness to interact with outsiders from their community, but they still continue having their stronger trust and interactions within the community. And in terms of economic behavior, they are more agriculture, there is more agricultural employment and more an economy of subsistence, relying much more on subsistence crops, lower use of public goods. We see that there are more schools that were constructed in this area, but when you ask about usage of these public goods is much lower and less integration with private markets and even with the states. So it seems that this social contract made these communities more inward-looking and self-reliant. But then the question is why these norms that seems to be leading to some negative economic consequences, why do they still persist? Why do they keep this social contract? And here is where the context that came later is very important. And actually is what I was telling you before, that is persistent, it's not mechanically. It brings this economic cost, but also brings these social benefits, which is actually something that I didn't describe, that the context in the post-war was not perfect. Still, there was violence, not violent led by a military state or elite, but by gang violence that arrived post-conflict into the country. And actually what we observe, which is super interesting, is that these areas that were formerly controlled by guerrilla areas, they experience lower gang-related insecurity, lower gang recruitment. So they still have like this benefit that the social contract provided during the conflict, which was protection against the state, but here now it keep providing protection against the violence generated by gangs. And also, we find some evidence that point toward lower inequality and continual mutual support that continue, and also a bit more of resilience, like food insecurity does not increase in these areas despite having lower income, and plus they have more resilience towards weather shock due to this mutual support and social capital that we observe in these areas. So in certain way, these communities today are facing a trade-off between a lower aggregate growth for protection, solidarity, and insurance in a setting of weak state capacity in the post-conflict. We also look whether these norms erode across generations, and we did this survey there, and we compare whether you have older cohorts with respondents that were very young at the end of the war, And we actually see little evidence that this in-group solidarity and community engagement disappear among younger cohorts, which means that this persistence reflects an equilibrium that is sustained by these social benefits. So what do we learn here? And then again, I want to make emphasis that this is, I'm not claiming here that this is like the universal effects of all non-state actors or real governance, but what we are showing is that these social contracts may persist in the long run, that they're created during conflict, which is very important that they're created during conflict. They may persist because they have these economic costs and social benefits that can be mutually reinforcement. So to conclude, the legacy of this guerrilla rule, and maybe like to bring it's not only this destruction, it is also institutions and norms that the conflict creates. In this case, the FMLN, this left insurgent group, created an alternative social contract that was rooted in self-reliance, redistribution, and bonding social capital that persisted and generated economic cost, but it also generated this safety, solidarity, and resilience, which is very important in the context, in the post-conflict, where we still have other sources of violence and where the state still is not very strong. So in this way, the persistence is rational, non-mechanical. And that's all what I have for today. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, Maria. Thanks, and really well kept to time as well. And I think that's fascinating. I mean, you're actually demonstrating that people are making rational choices consistently about what their future is and how should they position themselves. I think actually you challenged quite a few assumptions about the nature of development, and very nice connection to Nathan's presentation as well towards the end, where you looked at this intergenerational relationship. So fantastic. Thanks so much. Mustahid, over to you to a different context now. You are on mute, Mustahid. We'd love to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. And thanks to Maria and Nathan for raising the bar so high. I don't think so I can match that. But in my earlier life, I was an economist trained at the World Bank, working in the global south, pretty much all around. In the process, I realized I needed to rely more on human voices than numbers. Nothing against numbers. But so my approach here is purely anthropological, qualitative. So it's a deviance in a way. The problem I'm working on is Canada's South Asian communities, primarily Bangladeshi diaspora, second generation youth, men, women, queer, and gender diverse. There is a pattern that the members of this youth diaspora, there is an elevated mental health risk, social isolation, and very high alarming suicide rate, approximately 25 to 35 annually, which is almost double than Canadian national average. And these challenges are intensified by Islamophobia, racialization, homophobia, and pressures from intergenerational cultural expectations. The main objective of my research is bridging the spatial or distance gap and temporal or generational gaps. I will start with a verse of Jalaluddin Rumi, who is sometimes referred to as America's best-selling poet. He was born in today's Afghanistan in the 13th century and wrote mostly in Persian. Here what he said is, out between ideas of disbelief and faith, there is a field. I will meet you there. I do repeat. Out between the ideas of disbelief and faith, there is a field. I will meet you there. In this line, Rumi acknowledges that there is a spectrum from no belief to the devout, and he advocates rising above whatever form of religiosity one inherits, turning instead towards thinking, discussing, and developing. The larger picture is faith and art exist together for Muslims too, and my findings connect recent migration and diaspora scholarship with what is missing and the missed opportunities for critical thoughts. And that's the context for my research. Earlier, a few years ago, in early 2020, a young Bangladeshi Canadian in his early 20s killed his entire family, his parents, younger sister, his grandparents, and that stopped Canada. When judge asked, son, what happened? And his reply was, I don't want to be an engineer. But instead of not being an engineer and telling my parents that I do not want to be an engineer, it was my choice to get rid of them. And I do not seek parole in the next 40 years. Every year also, Bangladeshi youth, there are reports about jumping in front of train, drowning themselves in Lake Ontario in winter. Building upon this, I piloted my research with exploring stories of men because the reported suicides were only men. And I worked with a number of social workers in the diaspora community, right? Mainly to bridge the thin layer of trust from my interlocutors. And these social workers told me that actual number of suicides, it's almost quadruple than the reported numbers, right? And then we added on females, queer, and gender diverse participants. For framework, we didn't know how to go about it. So I looked into the Canadian indigenous elders, what they talk about trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. Then we also looked into Clara Hand's psychoanalysis, where she talks about how trauma travels through memory and silence, right? Sama Zaber, a Palestinian activist and a medical doctor who unpacks trauma in a way without undermining any type of trauma. She argues that if somebody gets into an accident, that person can be traumatized. At the same time, when somebody watches their 4 generations or generational construction is demolished by a bomb, that trauma is so deep that it cannot be compared with the trauma of somebody getting into a car accident. So we need to understand trauma in a different way, right? And also Farah Ghanem, who talks about that masculinity is not linear, men can cry too, and that there is nothing effeminate about it. For methods, I have both insider-outsider positionality. As a Bangladeshi scholar in Canada, I'm both part of and apart from this narrative. My research is not neutral, it's biased in so many ways, and it is an act of care though, and also perhaps a way to channel and voice my own unprocessed chronic childhood trauma. I share many of the same cultural codes with my interlocutors, the same unspoken fears of bringing shame, the same desire to prove my worth in my family, in a society that often sees Muslims through suspicion. However, I also carry the privilege of advanced education and access and resources that come with it, and the responsibility, if not a moral obligation, to turn grief into knowledge. I'm not the sole voice in my community. I'm one among many, trying to create a space where others can speak without fear. The primary data collection methods are network-centric participatory research and collective biography. NCPR helped me to map relationship and power dynamics within communities as data in themselves, illuminating who gets to speak to whom and under what conditions. And collective biography helped me to gather small groups of participants to tell and collectively analyzing their own stories and generate theory from lived experience rather than imposing an external framework. And when either of them did not work, we supplemented with embodied inquiry or semantic methods, including body mapping, movement exercise, sensory walks, approaches developed in trauma-informed qualitative research that access embodied knowledge that verbal or visual methods may miss, right? And for dissemination, because we are dealing with sensitive topic to begin with and very thin layer of trust. So anonymity, complete anonymity is the primary condition, is a precursor of our data collection. And we disseminate findings through digital storytelling, including podcasts, social media platforms, short form video content, familiar to participants, right? And Today, what I'm going to share is from my upcoming monograph, Unquiet Minds, Agency, Inclusivity, and Mental Health in Racialized Muslim Canadian Youth, to be published by the Canadian University of Toronto Press. I want to share that I am dedicating this to Bangladeshi fathers who sacrificed everything for their children's education, but who could not communicate love. Mothers feared community gossip more than emotional collapse, and also to youth who translated depression into silence because they thought expressing vulnerability felt like betrayal. I'll read a poem that was shared with me. I'm honored to share this with you. I'll read it out loud. I carry 2 passports, one for the soil that birthed me, one for the streets that raised me. But where do I belong when my accent stumbles between Bangla and Brooklyn slang? My parents' dreams are heavy, a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer. But what if I want to be a poet, writing verses about the ache of being neither here nor there? At home, I'm Amina, polite, obedient, Bangla flowing like Podda. At school, I'm Amy, loud, confident, English, sharp as a knife. Who am I when no one is watching? They said America was gold, but no one told me about the student loans, the glass ceilings, the loneliness of being brown in a white world. We communicate with interlocutors through illustrations. Here, a graphic artist shared this with us, that the theme negotiation, constant negotiation for the second generation to blend in, comes in. And here, in the words of an interlocutor, chained by obligations, trying to break cycle of control. In Bengali, Thik achi means I'm okay, but the person is lonely with nobody to talk to, with cell phone only being the lifeline, right? Among the queer and gender diverse youth performances, the drag, I think the illustration is quite explanatory, self-explanatory here. Moving on, I'm not saying, when parents ask their children to be doctors or lawyers to make it in the Canadian world, they are victims too. Parents are victims too. And when we spoke to South Asian parents, especially men, we came across a couple of patterns, right? I will also share the findings among the youth, but what stands out is we spoke to multiple parents, men, who grew up during the famines of 1944 that was handmade by Winston Churchill, who wanted to take away food from bumper crops from the Bengal region I think as stockpile for the British soldiers fighting elsewhere. And in 1974, another famine that took place due to mismanagement and corruption in the food distribution system. So children from those era that grew up and migrated to Canada and raised their children here in Canada, these men load on carbohydrates. And another finding is they cannot spend money. They want to save everything because they grew up in famine where one witnessed someone throwing up, and that thrown up content was eaten by hungry children, right? So that trauma, unprocessed, trickled down decades after here in Canada, saving everything, in a habit of saving everything, not allowing children to save anything. One particular owns 7 houses in the GTA, Toronto area, but lives in the basement, and one of his sons took life. Pattern of concealment is another pattern that came up, that among these men, because they are known to suppress their emotion, right? in a FGD, we spoke to 8 fathers, and we asked, how did you come to Canada, just to create a conversation, and all said we were federal skilled workers. And after the session, the seasoned social worker confided with me that, oh, they all came through spousal visas or as refugees. When I spoke to each of these fathers separately in a semi-structured interview, what I got to learn is their fabrication, their own history is not a mere vanity. It is a symptomatic expression of masculine identity that got destabilized by displacement and created dependency, where psyche reorders the past to protect a fragile present, right? What it reveals is that the fathers are operating under these conditions in their psyche. And it lacks a model, it lacks an emotional transparency for their children. So what children learn is they see their fathers being absent or distortion as the ambient knowledge of family life, right? That's the father side or parent side. And young female, now I'm talking briefly about the young female, they are subtly forced to navigate their lives based on expected gender behavior, right? And make career choices, marriage, family obligations, all are marked with gender. Their socialization has to be all based on gender, and often their abilities and resources and talents are devaluated. One interesting observation I came across after speaking to a mother, an elderly mother, that how she differentiates her daughter and daughter-in-law. This person in her 70s raised her daughter to be an investment banker. With Bangladeshi parents, kids have to be either doctor, lawyer, or a finance person, generally. But this mother expects the daughter-in-law to stay at home and take care of the in-laws. So how the difference, it's not men subjugating women, but also women subjugating women, educated women subjugating women. These are interesting findings. For queer and gender diverse, they always have to carry a weight of invisibility. Like they always have to be strategized about counseling their survival strategy, right? And because they know parental denial is constant, generational divide is constant. Often the suggestion to overcome this problem is get married, have kids, and then talk about your problems. Often also gender diverse and queer interlocutors would say that they either have to be feminine or masculine. They cannot be both. Two-spirited, nothing. And there are strict community or diaspora behavior about pretending that these things don't exist. And they often use religion conservatism to legitimize this sort of oppression. In summary, though, my research began with an urgency rooted in grief, confusion, and growing awareness that sometimes within Bangladeshi Canadian communities quietly unraveling, right? Over time, we realize that it's our responsibility to listen to everybody and offer a platform, or it can be mainly online, where we can start to believe that failure is not end of life. It's okay to fail, it's okay to cry, and it's okay to pursue any type of career because of the social safety net that Canada offers. It's okay, but we are far away from meeting our objective. It's just the awareness is going. And at the center of this tension lies the question of belonging. For many participants, belonging is never stable or guaranteed. It must be negotiated repeatedly across different spaces. That creates double marginality. right? At home, you have to be one. At workplace, you have to portray another self. And intergenerational trauma provides a crucial lens for understanding how these patterns persist. The experience of migration, economic hardship, and social marginalization carried by parents do not remain confined in one generation. They are transmitted through silence, expectation, and emotional distance. I think talking about it creates a space where hope is. That's where I will stop.
Thank you so much, Mustahid. Again, very powerful accounts. Really appreciate the way that you connected into emotional dimensions and also in sharing the poem and other ways of understanding what is a really complex set of relationships. But I think also really complementary to the presentations from Maria and Nathan as well. Different approaches, different contexts, but I think all three really saying something very profound about this multi-generational impact of people's life experience and how that plays out in the present and will undoubtedly continue to shape futures. So thank you so much, all three of you. Let's open it up. We've really heard some fantastic and deep sharings of experience and knowledge. Any questions that anybody would like to ask or to comment? Feel free to put your hand up. We should definitely take a few minutes to give a chance for any discussion. Or if you'd like to put something in the chat, because I realize quite a lot of this, what's been shared might affect you personally, and you may feel perhaps you'd rather share something in writing than by speaking. But if anybody would like to raise any questions. Yes, I see. Sorry, bear with me. I think a hand went up there. No. Would I mean, just to perhaps to round up, it might be that there aren't any specific questions or points anybody wants to raise, but maybe just to come back, Nathan, Maria, Mustahid, you've all three have heard each other's presentations. And do you have any quick thoughts yourselves about perhaps something that you're taking away, each of you, from hearing what the others have said? Maybe Nathan, I'll come back to you first.
Sure. Yeah. Just one thought for Mustahid. So you kind of outlined, situation for second generation Bangladeshis, and it's probably, it could be analogous for other people who had migrated from other locations. I guess one question is how much of this is because of a misalignment between the values which are, held by the parents, which come from the origin country, and then the values that the second generation individual sees around them? Or are these kind of pressures that the parents have, are they similar in Bangladesh? Or is it so is it kind of a cultural mismatch? Is that accentuating this or even causing it? Yeah.
Thank you. Very good question. There's parent side and there's youth side. From the parent side, we have had interlocutors who were practicing doctors and professors. But when they migrated, thinking, the bread and honey stories about Canada and not realizing how cold Canadian winter can be, right? They realized that their degrees and credentials did not transfer at all. So most of the interlocutors that are elderly, they instead, being a doctor back home, worked as taxi drivers in gas stations because of the linguistic issue they could not overcome. That was a big problem. So culture is different, right? And separately, we asked both categories of interlocutors, how much time in a week do you spend together hanging out when you are not receiving or giving career advice about saving money, or complaining about Toronto's real estate market, right? And I had to explain that question few times to each of the 49 interlocutors in the first round. Now we have spoken to more than 300, but the pattern is together over 300 people, they spend in a week less than 9 minutes hanging out. So communication, Nathan, is a big, big problem that has been identified here, right? And now, interestingly, our research is heavily funded by multiple federal government agencies here in Canada, and we are able to offer like dinner or hangout tickets to hang out or go to park, this and that, going to movies about both generations, right? But the youth are not interested. Despite offering $100 to spend 2 hours with your parents, you said, no, it's not worth it. It will turn into something negative and I will regret it. And even we said, let's learn something new. If you go to a cooking class, this and that, stitching, swimming, only one or two exceptions. One father started taking hip hop dance lesson with his daughter. That's fantastic. There are some group of young participants are learning how to make Bangladeshi way of making tea, which is boiling tea for almost 30 minutes and then add spices and everything. And it's a ritual, it's a meditation. And that's when people talk. And that's the part. It's the anthropology or sociology of water, sociology of tea, right? That's when you talk about it's the hangout. So I'm not an expert, but I'm also learning. But communication, my friend, is a big, big issue. Lack of it, actually, among the two generations. I hope that little bit answers your question.
But it was fascinating. I just following up on the comment of Nathan, it was fascinating. Actually resonates a lot. Like I'm from Argentina and I'm living in the US and resonates a lot with things of like, well, my mom is still in Argentina, but I keep thinking if this is not a thing of generations or is a thing that the first generation is still surrounding by similar culture values and that generates, a bit more of the class, but maybe if they would be also surrounding and communicating with other, this would change. How do you see it there? It varies, there is variation. Yes, for you.
Yes, Mustahid.
It depends on what Peter said, social class, resources and education, right? What you can afford. Many parents I spoke to, they have precarious jobs, not stable careers. So they work in shifts, right? So they are never home, unfortunately. Many prefer to work on cash. So the children stay home by themselves. And when I try to raise this gap to parents, and parents would say, what is my kid's problem? They have food, they have roof, they have the powerful passport of a strong country. They can travel anywhere in the world. What are they complaining about? And the kids would say, separately, of course, I didn't want any of this. I wanted you.
Oh, that's sweet, but it's funny because I say the same like to my son. He's only 5 years old, and I keep thinking he can't complain about anything. He has everything. I'm giving everything. But yes, it's super interesting. And
what we gather is this issue is not isolated. This is across immigrant communities. What now our work is expanding in Europe and Asia, and we see that the Sri Lankans, Punjabi communities within South Asia, then the South Koreans, there's a high suicide rate among second generation, right? Among North African immigrants in Canada. We also are seeing the same pattern pan-Canada and across the United States, right? And there's a larger presence of South Asian diaspora in Southern Europe, Western Europe, right? So that's where we are expanding, trying to expand our work. And we are in the process trying to develop collaboration between Japan and Korean institutions to understand and just talk about it and raise awareness, right? So that's where we are at.
Great. Thank you, Mustahid. Maria, I know you have to go. Is there anything?
No, I only wanted to give a comment to Nathan but it's a bit related. When I was hearing your talk and I said before, I kept thinking, so also bringing by my memories of where I grew up in Argentina. I went to this public school and we have with more like left wing, and there was always this thing of like when they were bringing like history, like calling about like no, now what comes to mind is theater of the oppressed, no, but theory of the oppressed that come, from communism, that always someone had to be, guilty of your, or taking out, which is kind of similar of this. And that's why I wasn't, at the beginning, always I was thinking, okay, probably Republicans, we will see most this shift. But then if I go back to this, of how I grew up, it's like, it makes sense, no? That like left-wing, more political parties would have a movement more like in the distribution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nathan?
Yeah. I think that's exactly the story in the US. So the right wing story would be, oh, if you don't have enough income, you're not working hard enough. The American dream's available to everybody. And then the American dream is not, oh, anybody can make it by taking from others. It's like baked in is anyone can make it, and then the unsaid part
Yes.
is you'll create it. Whereas the left-wing view is no, there's lots of structural issues, and the wealth and the inequality is connected.
No, but always like
Yeah.
I don't know. I keep thinking about this. Like every time I was learning like history in this school, I could see the difference because I went to different like type of school. That there was something about the oppressed. There is this oppressed and someone that
Yeah.
is taken. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very related and interesting.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
that's my only
Exactly.
final thought. But both talks were fascinating. I feel I texted Anna saying like I'm learning from your both presentations. Thank you so much.
No, thank you
Great.
all. I mean,
Yeah.
I have to say, I keep reminding students at the Institute of Development Studies about Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. And sometimes people say, "Who?" I say, "Oh no." If I was to pick one formative book that has influenced me in my entire life since I read it, it's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I think just listening to the evidence that you shared in different ways, whether it's stories or poems or, the outcomes of surveys or the kind of work, Maria, that you've done looking in the context in El Salvador. I mean, I think you've shared some fascinating light on a series of complex challenges that many people are trying to understand. So I think this is for EADI, this is definitely a dialogue that should be expanded and shared with a wider audience. And it's great it's been recorded, and I hope that many people will listen to it. So yeah,
I
thank
may
you.
add just
Please,
one thing.
Mustahid, the final
Uh,
word. Yeah.
Something an indigenous elderly, Canadian elderly indigenous mentioned on this related topic. She said something like, things we are discussing should not be about, in her opinion, left wing or right wing. It should be about the wingless. Uh, and she also reminded me that critiquing capitalism in North America labels everybody as communist, but critiquing capitalism is to strengthen capitalism so that it works for everybody. Isn't that the idea of capitalism? That left me speechless, but I thought I would just share with you.
Thanks, Mustahid. Actually, I clearly we can't leave just yet, because although Maria, you may have to leave, but now I think everyone has warmed up to the conversation, and there is one question in the chat, which is just about relating to trauma. I don't know if you can take a quick look at if anybody has any quick thoughts about that. Do we understand trauma as an event that happened to us in the past, or a process that's happening? And then Abra has mentioned a few points just to expand on that slightly. And then Anna, I can see your hand is up. So Anna, let's hear from you, and then perhaps we'll just have that quick discussion around these two things, and then we'll draw
Yes,
a close.
just to say, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, clearly.
Yes, just to say congratulations for the researchers, and I would love to have more meetings like this. I'm interested in the methodologies because we are from Ecuador, and I think we don't have too much work like this published, so we really need some methodology. I'm interested to ancestral wisdom in communities in the Amazon forest, and I would like to know how you reach the communities, how you do the work, how do you do the research. So just for this, and then thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Anna. So there's definitely an opportunity to share some of the background about how you actually did some of the research with those who've joined. That's a great question, Anna. So very quickly, let me just ask Mustahid, Nathan, any quick thoughts? Perhaps you have something that you can share afterwards. Any very quick responses on? It's a very big question around trauma, but let's just have just a couple of minutes and then we'll close out. So Mustahid, let me come to you first.
Sure. Thank you. Trauma is a very sensitive topic. So to begin with, there is zero or no trust or thin layer of trust at most, right? So working with trusted local community organizations and having presence of at least one or two social workers who can help navigate the pain, right, or suffering, sensitivity can go a long way. But ultimately, I would say don't give up when you failed, because I think what I'm here today, it's not a success story, but what I see that it's not giving up 100 times before when I failed with data collection and in the process, grant writing and everything. So it's a journey, evolving process,
Thank
painful
you.
though.
Yes, thank you, Mustahid. I think this is, I love the honesty behind this dialogue. It's been absolutely fantastic. Nathan, let's give you the last word and
Yeah.
then we'll draw to a close.
Yeah, I'll just try and answer the two questions. So Anna asked how you reach communities, and I think for economists in particular, it's important, you go to these communities which are more difficult to get to, for sure. And so the ones that you speak about, with me and my students work, former students work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which takes about 3 days to get to the locations. And then the other thing is relate to exactly what Mustahid said. You talk to people, and also you have to think about what knowledge they have and what questions you might ask that otherwise economists or otherwise scholars would not ask or would overlook. So indigenous wisdom, which you kind of touched upon, would be one example. So they're not going to voluntarily tell you this. They think, oh, you don't care about this, or our customary practices, or the way our world views, our cosmological views. It's like, oh, that's not something that Western academics care about and think about. And so if you want to understand that, you have to, make the effort to go to those communities and ask specifically about that. And also even knowing how to ask. Yeah, it's surveys is not the best place to start. And then just the one question in the chat, I think the question is also what Mika focused in a lot about. If you're thinking about, is there intergenerational transmission of a historical event? And it's through these kind of more cultural or interpersonal mechanisms. The concern is, well, maybe that event still has other, what Mika was calling mechanical effects. It affected, that historical shock is still occurring. And empirically with data, that's the difficult thing, is to try and disentangle those two. I think that's the heart of what the question by Abrar was asking. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan.
But
Great. Well, I think it has been a dialogue, virtual. Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to be in one place at the same time together at some point and continue this. That would be great. Big thanks to Nathan, Mustahid, and to Micaela. Anna, thank you very much indeed for facilitating us and getting us all in the same space. To EADI for supporting this series of webinars, which I think is a really great contribution. I hope everyone who's joined today will enjoy listening back to it. I think there's a lot of resources and points about methodological experience, ways of approaching this, which are available. So really, thanks to everyone involved, and hope to see everyone at the next EADI Virtual Dialogue.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. It's very fun. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.